Skyrim has been remastered and remade over and over again, from the special edition, the anniversary edition, that weird one for Alexa, which I thought was a joke, but apparently is real.
Now, Skyrim and life become one.
But for whatever reason, Oblivion has never received the same treatment, despite it being, in my opinion, an absolute masterpiece. And while it may certainly seem like Bethesda just does not care at all about its previous titles, there is, in fact, a lot more going on here than it seems. So today, I want to take a look at why Bethesda has yet, and may never, remaster or remake Oblivion. Now, when it comes to remasters or remakes, usually a studio needs a pretty good reason to decide to do it, especially since it's going to take a lot of time and money and resources away from making, I don't know, a different thing. But usually when a studio does decide to do this, it's because they're trying to test the waters for a possible sequel to a previous game. There's also the potential nostalgia factor that game studios can try and tap into that they might not be able to get just by making a sequel. And considering the massive success of the Elder Scrolls franchise, I don't think the first one there would ever really be a concern. Which means the only motivation they would have for remastering an old game would just be to tap into nostalgia. And unfortunately, that's not always a very lucrative market, especially if the game you're trying to remaster happens to be incredibly old with very old game practices that a more modern audience might not be accustomed to. And no, I don't just mean like no save files or the game is slightly more difficult. I mean things like bad UI, weird animation, janky controls, things that have been really ironed out as computers and game engines have gotten significantly better. Which means the better choice there might be to do a remake, but that means blowing out your budget to the equivalent of just making a sequel anyway, which in itself would already probably make more money than just re-releasing a better version of an older game. But we're talking about an Elder Scrolls game here, which means no doubt probably people would just buy it by the millions no matter what they did. Which means what we really need to look at here is how they would go about remaking or remastering the game itself. Now, something that's probably a little bit more obvious is that the older a video game is, the harder it's gonna be to remaster it. And while Oblivion doesn't seem like it's that old, it did come out 16 years ago, all the way back in 2006. But more importantly, it came out at a very pivotal moment for computer hardware. At the time, most CPUs, which was the thing that processed the majority of the math for your computer, except for the graphical stuff, was focused on increasing its speed. But around the mid-2000s, companies had started to hit a bit of a wall. Processing power and speed was only getting fractionally better. But there was another solution, and this is where cores started to be implemented. Suddenly, instead of being one CPU, it was technically two.
Multiply your possibilities. Introducing Intel Core 2 Duo, the world's best processors.
But because Oblivion was made just before this new discovery, it was not designed to utilize any of this. Oblivion is only capable of using one core on a CPU. And that means that if you happen to have a more modern CPU with 4 cores, you would only be using a fourth of the power your processor is designed to put out. And in order to get that to work, they'd have to go in and completely rewrite how this game interacts with your hardware. Along with that, there's quite a few other minor hardware issues that were common practices back at the time, but in hindsight, were obviously not good ideas. For example, the speed that Oblivion runs at is based on your frame rate, which means if you happen to try to play this game at a frame rate of 120 seconds, it's going to be moving way faster than it's supposed to. And these are all things that Bethesda fixed with their creation engine before they started working on Skyrim and Fallout 4 and Fallout 76. Now, I know what you're going to say, at least some of you, because I've heard it surprisingly way too often anytime somebody tries to bring up the idea of remastering this game. Why don't they just take Oblivion and shove it into the Skyrim creation engine? And I think this misunderstanding of how the creation engine works partially comes from the fact that Bethesda has been using the same engine since Morrowind, something that I've also iterated in the past. And while that's technically true, it's also very misleading, because over the years, especially in between the development of Oblivion and Skyrim, Bethesda has made a lot of changes and updates to this engine. And even the most minor of tweaks can fundamentally break everything that you've been working on. And if you've ever tried to fix a broken piece of code, you know that it's an absolute nightmare. Unfortunately, programs rarely tell you which actually actually being broken, and even when they do, it's usually not the answer that you're looking for. Oftentimes, it'll end up being easier just to delete the entire thing and start all over again. Every single texture, every single animation would be exactly the same as it was in Oblivion. Not really a whole lot would change. And that's just kind of assuming that they went in and fixed every single new problem that arises from trying to dump this old game into a new program. Most likely, it would actually just run way worse, and people would rather play the basic Oblivion because the new remake is garbage. I mean, if this was an actual easy solution, Sky Oblivion would have been released like 5 years ago. But there's way more to do with modernizing this game than just fixing the hardware problems. Because if that's all they really did, you would end up with a lot of people just complaining about how it's the same game and Bethesda didn't actually do anything, even though they probably spent tons and tons of man hours, possibly up to a year, trying to fix this stupid problem. A complaint people had with the Skyrim Special Edition and Anniversary Edition, despite the fact that Bethesda actually did replace a lot of textures. That's because updating processing power is really only going to do so much. The real issue that Oblivion has for a lot of people has to do with the models themselves, or specifically, I should say, the textures. People generally tend to assume that a more modern and higher graphic game requires a billion gajillion polygons. But the reality is that polygons aren't really as big of a deal as people think they are. I think a perfect example of gamers complaining about things that they clearly have no idea about has to do with backlash that Pokemon Sword and Shield received. The main complaint that people had was that the wireframe for Pikachu looked almost identical to the one from before. The polygon count was practically the same. And the truth is, if game developers had that many polygons in all their models, no computer in the world would be able to run these video games. But even if your computer could run every single character having a billion jillion polygons, it would be an absolute nightmare for the animators, because trying to animate a character when you can't even tell where his knee turns into his leg, fucking terrible. Instead, it's much easier to try and make your character as simple as necessary, so that way if something goes wrong, you can tell exactly what's happening and create a much easier solution in order to fix it. What's far more important, however, than a billion polygons is the textures, and that's the real issue that we're looking at with Oblivion. These textures are seemingly not even properly built for the models that they're placed on. Many of them on the faces are overly stretched, and there's even a ton of stretching on buildings as well. And fixing this issue means redesigning these textures completely from scratch, something that greatly increases our development time even further, which means now we're looking at fixing all of the hardware problems and every single texture in this game. And this puts Bethesda in an awkward position, because that means they have one of two choices. They could either go into the outdated Oblivion creation engine and just update it a little bit so that way Oblivion works slightly better for modern systems without really changing a whole lot, and cause the fan base to criticize Bethesda's supposed laziness for doing seemingly nothing despite actually putting in a lot of hard work. Or they could completely rebuild this game from scratch with the modern technology that they have. Now, if they were going to do that, they would either have to hire a totally different studio who might fuck it up because they have no experience with this game, and also it'd cost a ton of money, or they could take their own team off of building Elder Scrolls 6 and have them remake this game that's already out for everybody to play all over again. A decision that I know would have the fan base greatly upset. And that means that ultimately there really is no choice in remastering or remaking this game, because no matter what they do, it's just going to end up causing problems among the community. Now, since Microsoft has purchased Bethesda, things might actually be a little bit different, because now they'll have a lot more resources and money to be able to put into remastering old video games, and Microsoft themselves does in fact have quite a good track record when it comes to remastering video games. However, I personally don't even really think Oblivion needs to be remastered. It still runs perfectly well on my computer, and all of the problems that supposedly are in this game just kind of add to the quaint charm of it. If Bethesda was going to remaster/remake a video game, there are a few other options that I would prefer over Oblivion. Morrowind, for one, I think would be a much better choice. That game has not aged super well, and I think it'd be really cool to modernize that game for a more younger audience. I know that's a little blasphemous to all the Morrowind stands out there who hate the idea of video games being accessible, but you know, I don't care. But there is one other game that I personally would love to see get a remake, and that is Elder Scrolls Redguard. This game has possibly the best storyline out of all of the Elder Scrolls games, and some of the most interesting and innovative combat for its time. But due to its poor release and lack of optimization, mostly due to the fact that it was built on an engine that wasn't even designed to do 3D, it ultimately failed to receive much of an audience. And trying to run it on modern computers is almost impossible. The game is incredibly laggy and has a frame rate of like 2, which means that quite frankly, it would be the best candidate for a complete overhaul. However, unfortunately, I think that's probably the least likely of all of the options, because I don't think Bethesda has too fond memories of that game, especially since it was a massive failure that almost ended the company completely. But it was Todd Howard's first major project, and he is the head of Bethesda Game Studios, so a man can hold out hope. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a better understanding of why remasters and remakes, especially for games like Oblivion, is an absolute nightmare and most studios avoid doing it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.